On the 15th of September 1941, the Jewish star was introduced into Germany.
I can still see my mother sitting there and sewing on the yellow stars. I started to protest, as was my way, even when I was a young boy, and I said loudly, "I'm not going to put it on." Then my father said, "Wear it with pride." So I did wear it with pride.
These scenes are from a Nazi propaganda film made in October 1941 in Stuttgart. 210,000 Jews were still living in Germany and Austria.
Suddenly you saw thousands of Jewish stars. Neighbors were wearing them too. Are they Jews? Are they Jews? You throw up your hands over your head in disbelief at seeing so many Jews. And the non-Jews in the first 2 or 3 days stared at us as though some kind of miraculous creature were walking along. Then all at once, after the 3rd or 4th day, nobody on the street looked at you anymore. Either they turned round so that they didn't have to look at you, or they stared straight through you, expressionlessly, as though you were made of glass.
Berlin, 1932. A choir rehearsal for Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. 7 years before the outbreak of war, 500,000 Jews were living in Germany.
The fundamental mood was anti-Semitic. You just knew who was a Jew. You didn't ask other Germans whether they were Catholics or Protestants or whatever. But if somebody was a Jew, then that was something special. He was something different.
That same September, an anti-Semite was electioneering. It was Adolf Hitler.
Sie können uns meinetwegen töten, kapitulieren werden wir nicht.
You know, we have to be clear about one thing. Hitler did not invent anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a poison that's existed for hundreds of years.
Anti-Semitism existed in the Kaiser's empire and in the rest of Europe. It wasn't exclusively a German phenomenon. The roots went deep.
The Jews are supposed to have been responsible for Jesus' death 2,000 years ago. They're supposed to be Jesus' murderers, defilers of the heavenly host. That was preached. It reaches right into religious music like Matthew's Passion. So people were already prepared for what Hitler was going to bring. Christian preaching, I want to say quite clearly, did not lead to Auschwitz, but it made Auschwitz considerably easier.
Es machte es wesentlich leichter.
The seeds of the Holocaust were sown in the First World War. Radicals incited hatred of the Jews at the front and at home. After the German defeat in 1918, there was social and economic chaos in Germany. Nothing was the way it used to be.
We of that generation born between 1912 and 1925 lived at a time when there had been the First World War. There had been revolutions, counter-revolutions, white and red terror. There had been constant executions. A human life wasn't worth very much.
Many far-right groups in Germany claimed that Jews were responsible for the German defeat in the First World War. Hitler became their leader. From the early days of his political career, he demanded complete removal of the Jews. As early as 1924, he wrote, "If at the beginning of the war 12 or 15,000 Jews had been gassed, then German soldiers would not have died in vain."
You only needed to read his Mein Kampf, and then you knew everything that he would do when he got to power. But only very, very few people did that. My husband read it and he said he'll carry all that out.
On the 30th of January 1933, Hitler came to power, and anti-Semitism became state policy. Yet for many, it remained in the background.
In the street, you saw very many more happy faces than before. People were beaming. They somehow had a purpose in life. They had ideals and something to live for. They had the feeling that life was worthwhile.
A month after Hitler seized power, the last free election was held in Germany. 44% of the population had voted for Hitler's Nazi Party. People who actively opposed the regime were arrested and sent to concentration camps like these in Halle and Oranienburg. Most were put in camps for being communists, social democrats and trade unionists, not because they were Jewish.
There was a dark side to it, but on the other hand, there were a lot of good things, and so it evened out. We didn't want to go around the whole time in sackcloth and ashes because of regrets for what other people had done that we hadn't had anything to do with.
While the Germans looked away, others protested against the Nazi dictatorship. On the 23rd of March 1933 in New York, there was a Jewish protest march against the Nazis.
Sie sollen sich hüten. Einmal wird unsere Geduld zu Ende sein und dann wird den Juden das freche Lügenmaul gestopft werden.
The anti-Nazi demonstrations abroad against Germany gave Hitler an excuse to take action. On the 1st of April, there was a Nazi boycott of Jewish shops and businesses in Berlin. The exclusion had started. Very few people tried to stop it.
If I see injustice, but I don't feel that I'm strong enough to fight it, then I look away. That I think is a perfectly natural thing, which you shouldn't attach too much importance to.
This rare footage shows a boycott of Jewish shops in the town of Halle.
Of course, there was only a minority of Germans who were implicated in the crimes against the Jews. But the important thing was the complete indifference with which people in general ignored it and accepted it.
All over Germany, anti-Semitism was encouraged. The anti-Semitism in the magazine Der Stürmer was so virulent that many considered it pornographic.
Sie trugen ihren zersetzenden Einfluss in die Kreise des deutschen Handels. Aber keineswegs nur in den Handel trugen sie ihren raffenden Geist. Sie vergewaltigten auch die deutsche Kultur.
If someone is looking to hate, then the Jews are always an appropriate target. Well, it suited a lot of people. The Jews must go, the Jews are taking our places.
The next step was that Jewish professionals lost their jobs and Jews were banned from many public places.
At the entrance to the swimming pool, we saw a sign, "Jews are not allowed to enter the swimming pool." We couldn't believe it, because the chief swimming pool attendant was a friend of ours. His sister had been our maid for 10 years and practically brought me up. So we went on, and he came towards us and explained that Jews no longer had any place in German swimming pools.
In deutschen Schwimmbädern nichts mehr zu suchen.
And then we kept urging our father, "Father, let's leave this country." And he always said the same thing. "Nothing can happen to us because I have fought for this fatherland." He and his 4 brothers had been in the First World War, and he had been given the Iron Cross Second Class when he was a sergeant, and he believed that this would protect him.
Dass das ein Schutz wäre.
But anti-Jewish laws were passed in 1935. In these scenes from a carnival at Nuremberg, Jewish puppets hang from gallows. Hitler's Jewish officers from the First World War were no longer protected.
But of course, people said our Führer doesn't know anything about it. It's his subordinates, Himmler and Heydrich, and perhaps Goebbels, that rabble-rouser. But if the Führer knew that his Jewish officers of the First World War were having to suffer like that, he would bang his fist hard on the table.
But the Führer did know, and he wanted it like that. In March 1938, Austria was incorporated into the Reich. A 185,000 Jews lived in Austria. They were badly treated from day one.
The tragic thing was that sometimes you heard shouts behind you, and you knew that people were being beaten up, but you couldn't even turn round. I mean, if you had turned round, then you would be for it yourself. And you couldn't run away either, because otherwise the same thing would happen, and so you tried to make yourself invisible.
But that wasn't enough for the Nazis. The Jews had to leave. Their idea was that when these children were grown up, there should be no Jews left in Germany.
Erzieht die Kinder zu einem gesunden Hass, zu einem gesunden Zorn. Sagt den Kindern jawohl mit der Peitsche. Hat sie hinausgehauen. War ein Hasser der Juden. Erzeugt diesen Hass.
Gypsies too were targets.
Nicht Hitler.
It wasn't Hitler, Goering, Goebbels or Himmler who dragged me off and beat me up. No, it was the cobbler, the milkman, the postman. They got a uniform, an armband and a cap with a skull and crossbones on it, and they then became the master race.
In July 1938, at Evian, Lake Geneva, delegates from 32 countries met for a conference on the refugee problem. But no one wanted the Jews from Germany.
Representatives from one government after another stood up and said, "We can't give any visas." The only one who offered to let Jews in was the Dominican Republic. They wanted to take in 5,000 Jews.
Sometimes I still wake up at night and hear this combination of noises. Splintering glass, wood being cracked with an axe, and loud men's voices, men screaming, "Jews must perish."
On Kristallnacht, the Nazis had organized attacks on synagogues throughout the Reich, setting them on fire.
We ran into the yard, and coming into the yard, we could see that the synagogue was already burning, and the fire brigade was just standing there.
Und daneben stand die Feuerwehr.
I hoped that the fire brigade would protect my synagogue, as I called it, but that wasn't the case. It was allowed to burn down to its foundations, while all the houses in the neighbourhood were protected.
Häuser in der Nachbarschaft.
There could be no illusions any longer.
When my father came home again that evening, he finally used my words. We must leave this land.
But it was too late. The 30th of January 1939 was the anniversary of Hitler's coming to power. He was planning to attack Czechoslovakia. He also threatened Britain and France and issued a warning to the world.
Ich will heute wieder ein Prophet sein. Wenn es dem internationalen Finanzjudentum in und außerhalb Europas gelingen sollte, die Völker noch einmal in einen Weltkrieg zu stürzen, dann wird das Ergebnis nicht die Bolschewisierung der Erde und damit der Sieg des Judentums sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
In March 1939, Hitler had taken Prague, and no one had stopped him. He became even more ambitious.
And he said, "Your generation has been called to provide living space for the German people, to extend it. And you have also been called to make sacrifices for the German people."
In September 1939, Poland was attacked. Hitler had gone too far. Britain and France declared war on Germany. Behind the front lines, war crimes were taking place.
When the German troops marched into Poland, in every little town there was always a circle of important people. The doctor, the chemist, the priest, and the schoolmaster. Usually they were all shot. Hitler's fascists marched in and shot the priest, the teacher, the chemist, and the doctor.
The idea was that by murdering the Polish intelligentsia, resistance could be crushed forever.
Ein seltsamer Leichenzug bewegt sich durch Kielce. Ein Geistlicher und ein Wagen mit 6 frohen Särgen ohne Trauergefolge. Erschossene polnische Verbrecher.
They had been murdered on orders from above.
And then a few officers told us in detail about the terrible things that had happened. It was bad that they had happened, but what was terrible was that people had not been punished, that it had been tolerated. The Poles had been treated as inferior human beings.
Das war das Entsetzliche.
Poles became second-class citizens and were forbidden to mix with Germans. Those who broke the rules were publicly humiliated.
There have always been individual cases of immoral or amoral leadership. That wasn't disturbing, but what was unimaginable was that the state as such was criminal, that the state as such deceived you, that the state as such killed somebody because he had a crooked nose, or because his face didn't fit, or because he was a Pole.
Das war unvorstellbar.
In the world of the master race, there was no longer a place for the Jews. By now, 2 million Jews were living under German occupation.
But the Jews in Poland weren't worried. We didn't know the meaning of German Nazism before the beginning of the Second World War. We couldn't imagine how deep in their mentality, in their consciousness, these ideas had been driven.
While the war was raging at the front, a second wave of crime began. Hitler ordered the killing of mentally and physically disabled people.
It was expressed like this: there is life that is not valid, that is sickly or simply lived on too low a level, and this life has to be mercifully released from the earth.
This is the concentration camp at Posen in the winter of 1939. It was here that for the first time people were murdered using carbon monoxide gas.
It wasn't called killing them, it was called releasing them, but it was still murder.
This was the first gas chamber at Posen. Over 100,000 disabled people were murdered in the Reich.
At that time, I learned that Hitler despised human beings as such, whether they were Germans or Russians or Jews. Of course, he had special enemies, Jews and Gypsies, who were treated even worse, but in principle, he despised human beings.
By October 1939, Poland had been defeated. Hitler spoke to the Reichstag in Berlin. He said he still hoped to make peace with Britain.
Churchill mag der Überzeugung sein, dass Großbritannien siegen wird. Ich zweifle keine Sekunde, dass Deutschland siegt.
Hitler's peace offer was refused.
He was in love with England. I felt it particularly when I put my career on the line by marrying an English woman. He never held that against me, never. He was Anglophile to the very marrow.
Und war anglophil bis in die Knochen.
By June 1940, Hitler had successfully invaded France. He was still hoping to win Britain's goodwill. But he was unsuccessful.
But then, of course, when everything goes wrong, then Mr. Jekyll, of course, turns into an enraged Mr. Hyde.
Mr. Jekyll, natürlich ein wütender Mr. Hyde.
As Britain refused to cooperate, Hitler embarked on a bombing campaign in August 1940. It continued throughout the autumn, but was unsuccessful. Hitler now decided to attack the Soviet Union.
We were told the Red Army is incapable of fighting. The Finnish War proved that. Stalin had killed all his generals. In 6 months we will be in the Kremlin, and then the English will want to make peace.
Hitler prepared for war against the Soviet Union. It was to provide territory for Germany to expand and to destroy what he called Jewish Bolshevism.
Nicht vermeiden möchte ich auch den Hinweis noch darauf, den ich schon einmal tat, dass nämlich, wenn wirklich die andere Welt von dem Judentum in einen allgemeinen Krieg gestürzt wird, das Judentum damit seine Rolle in Europa ausgespielt haben wird.
In June 1941, Hitler attacked the Soviet Union in what was known as Operation Barbarossa. At first, Hitler's army sensed victory.
General Paulus said to me himself that he had been forbidden, when making his plans for Operation Barbarossa, from preparing for the winter. He had been forbidden from doing that. It was supposed to be unnecessary, because by then everything would have been over. We would have won.
Special units called Einsatzgruppen followed the troops in. As in Poland, they were ordered to murder the intelligentsia. They killed mostly Jews.
It was a real turning point, the moment when Hitler attacked Russia. From then on, you heard about continual mass shootings.
At the end of July 1941, the advance slowed down. There were disputes amongst the leadership.
the 4th of August, Hitler came to the Army Group Center and consulted with both Panzer Group commanders, Hott and my father. Each of them told Hitler independently and without knowing what the other had said, what had happened and what should happen now. And of course, everybody was of the opinion that the offensive towards Moscow had to be continued.
But Hitler took a different view. He insisted that part of the army be redirected to the Ukraine.
The decisive turning point of the war was certainly the fact that the original idea of reaching Moscow and taking the land around Moscow was abandoned, and then something quite different was embarked on.
It was the biggest crisis of Hitler's career so far. On a visit to the southern flank of his army, he suddenly became seriously ill.
I think Hitler knew he'd lost the war then. When the Russian campaign began, he said it must be all over within 6 months. Otherwise, it will all have been in vain.
On the 14th of August 1941, the British and American governments held a summit conference at sea. They drew up a treaty, the Atlantic Charter. Hitler's calculation that Britain would come round was finally seen to be mistaken. The Atlantic Charter demanded that the Nazi regime be destroyed.
In normal times, you call the police to keep order, but not in wartime. The worst thing that anybody could imagine was that there could be a repetition of what it was like in 1917 and 1918 at the end of the First World War, when people at home became rebellious against the troops on the fighting front. That would have been the worst thing imaginable.
In August 1941, when Hitler visited his troops in the Ukraine, victory seemed assured. But in case there was unrest at home, Hitler had given SS Chief Himmler the task of murdering those already in the concentration camps, trade unionists, communists, Jews, and others opposed to the regime. But what would happen to all the Jews who had not yet been arrested?
They had to go somewhere. There was talk about sending them to Palestine, and then about sending them to Madagascar, then that they should be settled somewhere in the east. And that was actually the only solution which we thought had any kind of prospect of being practicable. But from the very beginning, we doubted the honesty of these plans.
Autumn 1941. A funeral service for people killed in bombing raids on Germany. Nazi propaganda blamed the Jews for the deaths and threatened revenge for their supposed crime.
Sollten wir Deutschen in diesem Kampf besiegt werden, dann würde dieses deutsche Volk mit Stumpf und Stiel ausgerattert. Der Jude würde ein Erbarmen nicht kennen, eine Gnade nicht kennen. Es ist dieser Kampf auf Leben und Tod. Sein oder nicht sein, unerbittlich. Gott Jehova, Gott der Rache, würde dich fressen.
It was taken for a matter of course and proven that Jews throughout the world hold together through hell and high water, and also that the German Jews were really marionettes, being manipulated on strings by American Jews and also French and English Jews.
Juden, aber auch der französischen und englischen hingen.
In September 1941, Hitler's headquarters in the east became the decision-making center. The first move was to order the deportation of Jews from the Reich to the east.
Hitler said, while tens of thousands of German men lay down their lives every day so that this Bolshevik menace doesn't invade our European culture, our lovely Europe, then as long as that continues, the Jews, and here he used an expression which I would not like to repeat, will also not have the nicest life.
A new German governor took office in Prague. His name was Reinhard Heydrich.
You knew that he was a very capable and incredibly efficient man, but also that he was very dangerous.
Since August, Heydrich's Einsatzgruppen in Russia had also started killing Jewish women and children. Now his task was to prepare the so-called final solution. He was able to rely completely on his henchmen.
Most of them waited to see what the official line would be today. What would Heydrich say? And they repeated it mechanically. Or they even anticipated what they thought he was going to say.
In June 1941, one henchman, Adolf Eichmann, was watching a handball tournament.
Spätsommer, als Heinrich mich zu sich befahl. Und sagte mir, der Führer hat die physische Vernichtung der Juden befohlen.
Eichmann's job was to send Jews from all over Europe to their death.
They would have done everything if it was an order from above. Everything. Even if Heydrich had taken a telephone book and said, "Find everybody whose names begin with P," and put them into the camp.
But many of those who carried out the orders suffered psychological problems.
Every day, more than 30 people, sometimes even 50 or 60, wanted to claim illness. But usually only a few of them were allowed to go sick, and then they got some tablets or other. There were nervous breakdowns, there were suicides, and people were sent to mental hospitals.
Und es gab Verschickungen in Narrenhain-Anstalt.
In September 1941, an experiment was carried out in Mogilev in the Soviet Union. Disabled people were to be killed using carbon monoxide from car exhausts.
There were also murderers who then committed suicide. And so a search went on to find impersonal means of killing. Because if somebody had 3 children at home, and he had killed a few children, he wasn't the same anymore. And so that's how gas was decided on.
In 1941, euthanasia experts arrived in Belzec in occupied Poland to set up an extermination camp. The killing was increasing everywhere.
Im Herbst 1941 kommen Nachrichten.
In autumn 1941, there was news from the Eastern Front that in one place 5,000 people had been killed. In another place, 3,000. And in a third place, 10,000. These news items came from different sources and were doubted. But in October 1941, I understood finally that a quite systematic policy of extermination was being carried out on the Eastern Front.
Ausrottungspolitik an der Ostfront betrieben wird.
By 1941, Hitler's staff knew what he intended for the Jews.
Ich erkläre feierlich, sagte damals der Führer, dass damit die Judenfrage in ganz Europa grundsätzlich und einmalig gelöst wird und dass wir es wissen, wenn der Führer solch einen Satz spricht, dann heißt das Vernichtung des Judentums und das wollen wir und dazu bekennen wir uns.
In October 1941, I came to Berlin from France, and that was the day when for the first time the huge mass transportation of Jews out of Berlin were taking place. They were loaded onto cattle trucks at Grunwald station and taken off to Poland, and this communist asked me then, "What are they going to do with them, Count?"
The deportations were beginning all over the Reich, heading towards the ghetto in Lodz, in Poland.
I shrugged my shoulders and said, "What are they going to do? They'll be taken to a concentration camp." But of course, if you'd thought about it properly, you would have been quite clear that they were to be murdered, that they were being taken there to be killed. But you didn't make that connection at that time. That really is one of the darkest moments of my life.
The ghetto in Löwenstadt, near Lodz, had become a waiting room for death. But back in Germany, Jews were already forgotten.
People were no longer interested in the Jews. They were preoccupied by their men at the front, by their ration cards, by the eternal bombing raids. So a few Jews were just not interesting anymore.
In October 1941, the German army on the Eastern Front came to a standstill outside Moscow. The soldiers were completely unprepared for the winter.
We were just not equipped for this winter. We had no winter clothing at all. We just had summer clothing. Most of the losses that we had were through frostbite and typhus.
The Blitzkrieg in the East had finally failed, and it was not just Hitler who sensed it.
Nobody believed in a final victory anymore. It just wasn't on. Now it was just a question of surviving.
On the 7th of December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Hitler declared war on America. Now it really was a world war, and Hitler blamed the Jews for it.
Auch wenn wir nicht im Bündnis mit Japan stünden, werden wir uns darüber im Klaren, dass es die Absicht der Juden und ihres Franklin Roosevelt ist, einen Staat nach dem anderen allein zu vernichten.
It was all quite peaceful and orderly. You got a postcard from the Reich Union of Jews and it said, "Dear so-and-so," or "Dear Miss," or "Dear Mrs. So-and-so, on such and such a date, please be ready to travel to the work camp."
This footage shows thousands of Jews assembling at the Killersberg camp in Stuttgart. Only 28 would survive.
And then one day the bell would ring and the Gestapo would be there, or the army, or the police, and they would say, "Are you Miss Schönlang, or are you Dr. Schönlang, or are you Mrs. Schönlang? Please take your luggage." It was all quite peaceful, and then you walked downstairs because we weren't allowed to use the lift anymore, and you saw the lorry standing in the street, and your luggage would be taken and stowed somewhere in the corner, and then everybody got onto the lorry and drove off.
People were told that they could build up a new life in the East. It was a lie.
When it was my turn, I was so naive. The Gestapo man, he said, they're sending you to the east to work. And I said, perhaps they can send me to my mother. And he laughed in such a horrible way, and so ironically, and said, you'll get to your mother soon enough.
Even before the Jews had gone, their flats were redistributed.
We were allocated a flat, and there was a charming old gentleman there who looked like Albert Einstein, and we had a very nice conversation. He said, unfortunately, I've got to leave this flat, and what I hate most of all is leaving my grand piano. He played a few chords wonderfully and said, treat it well for me, and he stroked the keyboard. And I started sobbing again and said, I don't want to live in this flat.
The grand piano was auctioned to the highest bidder. Most Jews were left with only one suitcase.
He thought he would be taken to some kind of ghetto. He had no idea. He really didn't know, so he went off quite optimistically. He just said that he was sorry to leave his flat because he'd lived so many years there alone. He was a bachelor. He had such bright, clear eyes. I can still see him in front of me.
Most people had no idea where the trains would take them.
During the journey, it was said we're going to Riga. Riga didn't mean anything to me, but then we still hoped for work in the east, in Riga. And after 3 days, the train stopped, but it wasn't at a station, it was in a siding somewhere, and that was the first moment when I felt frightened.
Riga, the Latvian capital, was the last stop for 19,000 Jews from Germany. The houses in the Riga ghetto were empty.
There were household things lying around. Beds had been ripped open. It was indescribable. The woman who led us in was a lady who was helping. I suppose that she was from the group from Hanover or Cologne. I don't know anymore. And she said, you must make yourselves at home here. Latvians lived here. On a wall in the kitchen there was an inscription in German in pencil. Farewell, Mama. It was scribbled on the wall. The Latvian Jews said to us that their people had been shot to make room for us. At that time we didn't believe it, but sadly, it was all too true.
In January 1942, the chief administrators of the German Reich and SS leaders met at a villa by Lake Wannsee, near Berlin. Heydrich took the chair. The murder of Jews was on the agenda. It was calculated in great detail how many could be killed, including those in Turkey and Britain. The answer was 11 million. Now Hitler referred openly to the destruction of millions.
Zum ersten Mal werden nicht andere allein verbluten, sondern zum ersten Mal wird dieses Mal das echt altjüdische Gesetz angewendet. Aug um Aug, Zahn um Zahn.
He had repeated this threat on the 30th of January 1939, on the 30th of January 1940, and on the 30th of January 1941. Nobody took it seriously, just as nobody had taken Mein Kampf seriously. But I said to myself, you can't make the same mistake twice.
They didn't yet guess what fate had in store for them. In April 1942, Jews from Magdeburg gathered in the Warsaw ghetto. Most of them were to starve to death here. At home, Many had preferred death to a journey into uncertainty.
In 1942, my grandmother, whom I was very fond of because she was a good and clever woman, got the letter saying that she had to be ready for deportation with a little case. She took her life in the night. She knew what her fate was. That was a terrible day.
At stations all over the Reich, Jews waited to be deported.
It was on the 13th of July, 1942. It was a Sunday, and there was bright sunshine and a light wind. And I would say that there were about 18 elderly Jewish people waiting on the platform with a lot of luggage.
Some guards kicked their cases away, and they landed on the track.
Then the locomotive arrived and went slowly over the luggage. The suitcases burst. The feather beds and the pillows were torn to shreds, and the feathers were carried up into the air by the light wind, and then fell down onto the luggage like snowflakes. The train had already arrived, and a so-called golden pheasant stumped into the compartment in his brown jackboots and breeches and this light yellow jacket with a broad brown belt, and he settled himself comfortably on the upholstered seat, took his cap off, fanned himself and said, "Now Schleiten district is free of Jews."
The order was to leave no trace of the Jews or the crime. But in Kaunas, Lithuania, in 1943, mass graves were reopened on a flimsy pretext.
They said to us the Soviets had killed a lot of people and that the corpses in the ground would contaminate the groundwater. And so we were supposed to dig up the bodies and burn them.
In 1944, in Kluga, Estonia, the Red Army had arrived suddenly and taken the gravediggers by surprise. They didn't have time to finish their work.
Once, when we were opening a grave in Kaunas, I saw dead Austrian Jews. They were dressed and hardly decomposed. They had not been forced to take off their clothes. Until today, I can remember a pretty young woman. Her eyes and mouth were closed, as if she were asleep. An Austrian officer from the security service was standing there, and I could see how agitated he was. He stood next to the pit and smoked one cigarette after another. I heard him say, why have they done that? Why? How many of my friends are here?
Exploring the downfall of one of the greatest civilizations of all time, we'll be looking at the last Aztec, more for Monday at 9. Next, Tony Blair and his legacy in Snowmail.